Welcome to Press On Podcast with Mike Woodruff, where Mike and invited guests share insights to cultivate a biblical perspective and thoughtful resilience in challenging times.
Welcome back to the Press On Podcast. My name is Mike Woodruff, and today you're going to have a chance to listen to an interview I had the opportunity to conduct with David Miller, Tom Tropp, and Mike Zafirovski. So Dr. David Miller, who is a professor and leads an initiative at Princeton University that is focusing on work, and he had recently given a paper at the Davos Summit on trust and how religious institutions, and he was looking in Davos, he was talking about the great monotheistic faith traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, how they can help in restoring trust. Trust is, as you may know, collapsing across institutions. I think the only two institutions that are doing reasonably well right now is the military and small businesses. But government and media and clergy and education and all of these institutions, trust levels are at all-time lows. And so he had given a paper at Davos talking about how do we restore and rebuild trust. And he gave a version of that talk focusing on Christianity at the Good Work Summit, which was part of the Lakelight Institute. So it was the first big conference that we've held, and it wasn't a big conference, although we did sell out. It was the first summit that we have held, and we held it on work. So Lakelight Institute is focusing on these three initiatives: theological depth and imagination, on vocational discipleship, and on public theology. And so we asked Dr. Miller to give this talk at the summit, and then Tom Tropp, who is the chief ethics officer at Gallagher, Mike Zafirovski, who, among other things, is the former CEO of Motorola. He also reported into Jack Welch for years and years, and board member for Boeing and other things. Those three men were, and this was sort of wrapping up the summit, I had a chance to interview the three of them on this topic of trust. I hope you enjoy it. So, and thanks. There's a couple other panelists who are not able to be here, but thank you to all of you for being here today. And let me just say, Ben did a fine job introducing them. They're much more interesting than their introductions. And Mike, we had lunch this past week. Mike is, and Mike mentioned, and I've heard him say this twice, I confirm this. His first hero was Marshall Tito, and then it was Jack Welch, and now it's Jesus Christ. So I don't know anyone who's made that evolution, but he has done it very successfully. And ended in the right place, right. Tom and his wife, Mary Pat, who's in the back, they had, one of the fun things to mention about them, they had 78 foster children in their home over the years. The last one, who they adopted, became a good friend of my second son. And Tom and Mary Pat intervened when Sherry and I were about to kill one of our kids, who was the college selection process, and it was not going well. And Tom said, what if I met with him and helped him? So he successfully actually did apply and enrolled. And my wife said at the end of it, she goes, I think we all have reasons to be embarrassed at how we acted in the last year. So let's do a better job the next year. But Tom stepped in. And then you've heard from David. You don't know, but we share a John Stott connection. And you had a lot more time with John than I did. One of my stated fears, like a nightmare dream, was that I was going to stand up to speak one Sunday, and John Stott would be in the congregation, and I would be ill prepared. And one day I stood up to speak, and I looked out, and there was John. And I thought, there's no way. And then I saw that he was sitting with a couple who was on his board, and I thought, oh, that is Uncle John. And I realized I don't have a Bible in my hands, and I literally have like 10 seconds where I have to talk myself off the ledge, which ended with me saying, you're standing up to make an announcement. You know, like you don't have a Bible in your hand because you're announcing. It was an Ash Wednesday service, and so I survived. But anyway, we share the influence of Dr. Stott, which was so profound.
I sat at his feet. It was the other way around. Only a God kind of thing, but we were invited, my wife and I, to be in his small group, and we'd meet in someone's home, we'd rotate around. For those of you who don't know John Stott or Uncle John, I think it was Tim Keller who wrote an obit saying that if Protestantism had a pope, it would be John Stott, and that he was an intellectual giant, and some say he sort of saved Christianity in the UK and in many places around the world. But anyway, so I'm sitting at his feet and literally it's like taking notes and everything he said. And then somehow the couple that had led the group before, and he didn't lead it, he participated. My wife and I were asked to host the group or whatever, to chair it. And I had that same terrified, like, no, I'm not going to do a Bible study with John Stott sitting now at my feet. Like, no, this is all wrong. This is all wrong.
Well, so thank you. So I want to ask some trust-related questions, and so thank you for your work. Thank you for your insights, David. So I want to back up just a second. So you wrote about the restoration of trust and looking at the wisdom traditions and how we go about restoring trust. So the assumption here, and I just want to stress test it a little bit. The assumption here is that trust is a good thing. And Tom, you've been an ethics guy, chief ethics officer at a company that wins the ethics award. So you are twice in that ethics space. And I am assuming that you would say that ethics is not just a good thing and a right thing, but it is some sort of competitive advantage. Now, maybe you would say you would be ethical even if it wasn't to your financial best interest. I don't know if you would do that or not. You would say it, no doubt, because
honest.
One would think. But can you prove that cultivating trust and being ethical is good business?
Yeah, I think we can. First of all, if Pat Gallagher were here, the chairman of our company, he would introduce me as, this is Tom, he's the ethics guy, not the ethical guy. So I don't necessarily have to tell the truth here. We do a unique thing at Gallagher. We don't separate, but we compare compliance with ethics, and that's an important concept to keep in mind. Compliance tells us what we must do. Ethics tells us what we should do. It's about beliefs and values and culture. We are a publicly traded company on the New York Stock Exchange. We have over 50,000 clients. We're in 100 countries. We believe that we have a responsibility to earn a profit for certain of our stakeholders, so particularly for our employees, so that we can pay them a fair compensation, for our clients, so that we have the resources to provide the counseling and the assistance that they need. We're in the insurance space. Our motto is we put lives back together. That's what the insurance industry does. So we have to have the resources to do that, which means we have to make adequate profits. The third person that we feel we're required to make a profit for are our stockholders. They're the owners. It's appropriate for us to give them a fair, emphasize fair return on their investment. So those are the things we think we have to do. There's a next step, though, that we believe that we should do, and this is where we come into ethics, and that is we should earn a profit so that we can bring goodness to other stakeholders. Who are they? Our communities in which we function. We spend millions of dollars every year to, for example, sponsor Special Olympics globally, everywhere in the world. Started with one employee walking into my office one day and saying, Tom, my son is in Special Olympics and there's going to be an event up in the northern suburbs. Could we possibly sponsor that event? And I said, well, yeah, what's involved? She said, it would be $5,000. I said, absolutely, we'll do that. within 2 years, resulting from that conversation, we sponsor Special Olympics globally, millions of dollars. We agree that we should do that for our communities. We believe that we should do things for the Earth. So we have a very aggressive climate change program going on. You've heard the term ESG. We're all trying to forget it. It came up early. It's now being disassembled by many organizations. But one of the key factors is E, environment. S is social. 4 years ago, Pat Gallagher asked me, he said, Tom, what is this ESG thing? I said, Pat, it's everything this company's been doing since 1927. They just finally decided how to spell it. We've been doing those things. We believe we should be active for climate change. We should be active for social responsibility, for helping our communities. So, can we do that and still make a profit? Yeah, because we choose to take part of the profit that we would be giving back to the mandatory stakeholders and putting it toward that. We're very proud to be part of the Ethisphere Institute's World's Most Ethical Companies. 13 years we've been on it. It's a difficult thing to get. They audit, they interview, 200-page survey has to be completed. At the end of each designated year, they publish a list, a graph, a chart of the results of so this year there was 135 companies in the world that made this list. Of those companies against a large cap stock index. Every year, that group of companies on the Ethisphere's list outperforms that that list of high cap companies by 13.6% average over 5 years. Now we have an $11 billion revenue company. 13.6% better than companies not on the list who are in our same industry. So we do believe, Ben Franklin said, you can do well by doing good. Ben probably copied it from somebody because that's what he did for most of his stuff. But it's brilliant, and we do believe it's true, Mike. And we do believe we justify it to our board. Our board is wonderful. They support everything we do. We justify it by that. And whenever I do that, when I speak to the board about that subject, always they come back and say, Tom, it's okay, even if you didn't make more money from that. It's what we should do. It's the right thing to do. So yeah, I think we can.
Okay, so I'm gonna kick the question down, Mike, to you. You agree? You make more money? I mean, are you cultivating trust as a competitive advantage, and it works?
First of all, Tom, thank you for being a Special Olympics client. I joined the board of Special Olympics earlier this year. I'm one of the best organizations in the world. Tim Shriver, the chairman of Special Olympics, he should be running for president of the United States, but he's chosen to be a teacher first, not doing something to really be giving back. So anyway, I know that Gallagher is one of the top 10 sponsors. So again, thank you very much. The short answer is absolutely. My first 30 years in business, I was 25 years at General Electric and almost 5 years at Motorola. I didn't realize a Motorola colleague is here with his son and daughter. They asked me, Mike, what are you going to talk about? I said, I have no idea. Whatever Mike's going to ask me, I'll provide a very transparent answers. I've used this when I speak to students or mentees. I thought Motorola and General Electric were among the most ethical companies, at least when I was there. I cannot talk for a time since then, but I said for two very different reasons. GE was the most valuable company, market capitalization, profitability, very visible CEOs, the last three, including Jack Welch. And Jack was convinced that every single attorney general would love to have the scalp of General Electric and put him in jail. So it's almost like a paranoia, all the compliance training and the convictions that an ethical company, you're risking not only your job, you could go in prison, but you can also impair what Jack was trying to have, the most competitive and best company in the history of the world. Eventually, when you go to the Middle East, there's somebody here from Siemens. The view was lots of companies, including in Germany. For example, the view of paying bribes to quote-unquote countries. They're not as ethical as the United States is acceptable. You can even bookkeep those entries as an appropriate expense. And Jack took it to a whole new level to say ethics and integrity should be a cornerstone to everything else which we do. And if I can just finish with that one, so really was as a youngster, was very appealing, both the carrot, but also the stick as well. And I use Motorola very differently. I'm very much of a Galvin family. I started as a family business, became one of the, arguably, Bob Galvin was the Steve Jobs of the 20th century, all the things. With the 4 E's for personal attributes for leaders, the 4 E's plus all is 1 E, ethics. So Motorola is coming from completely the other side. The view of unless you're ethical, you cannot attract the best and brightest. You're not going to allow you to be truthful and transparent. So at least for those 30 years, I not only I thought so, I firmly believed it, and it was a very positive way to attract the right people into the company.
People. Okay, so I want to stay with you for a second, Mike. And so the conversations about trust are a little bit new to me in the business sector. So I started a trust file 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I got asked to speak to a business on trust. It's like, okay, glad to do it. And I read, Covey had a book out called The Speed of Trust, and I did some other things, and I started a trust file. I didn't put much in it until the last couple years, and I pulled it out a couple months ago. First of all, there's all the books out that, suddenly, Yuval Levin has written about trust. Fukuyama has written about trust. Gottman's writing about trust. All these books are coming out on trust. And then I looked, and I had a piece from Commentary, Abe Greenwald, The Trust Crisis, Anthony Mills, New York Times, Why So Many Americans Are Losing Trust in Science, Gerard Baker, Wall Street Journal, How Americans Went From Trust to Bust. On and on it goes, all these podcasts. So I thought, okay, maybe I just wasn't tuned into these conversations. Did you have conversations with Welch about trust? I just heard you say he was worried about the Attorney General coming after him, but was he, for other reasons, trying to build into the people that was reporting to him this vibe about trust?
The short answer is absolutely. I have to qualify, I'm a huge fan of Jack Welch, not necessarily on the personal side, day-to-day, family, divorces, but when it came to business, and the honesty and transparency he provided to everybody. So that level of that whatever he told you can take it to the bank, and conversely. So there's the level of this, again, when I say I'm a huge Jack Welch fan, it was simply as a business leader, the one he provided, inspired, whether he went to Harvard or a community college locally was irrelevant. If he had the values, he can bring the results. There's no one better. And trust was the paramount of that. First page, if you give a report, and if page 50 of your presentation, there's something that was a surprise, you were done. So that level of tell me the truth, I can deal with everything. There's unlimited resources to do the right things. So from that perspective, and I try to bring that to my discussions, not only in business, but in the real life as well. So anyway,
so my sense, what little I know about Welch, and I know very little about Welch other than what you've told me, and I've read some books about him. Competence was very important, but you're saying your character was more important than your competence.
Your professional
Absolutely.
character.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. So, David, you're the expert here. I'm skittish about asking questions, but I guess I'm trying to ask these foundational questions. Whose trust, if you're advising CEOs, C-suite folks, and you're talking about trust, whose trust do they most need to have? Is it the boards? Is it their staff? Is it the customers? Is it the bankers? Does it get thought about that way, or can you not bifurcate it? Trust is trust, and
I guess I'm just wondering, what are we talking about?
Can I comment first on your first question just real quickly?
Absolutely.
Because I have a contrarian view to Tom and Mike. Well, not really, but kind of. So my students will ask a variation of your question, maybe not saying, because to me, ethics is, it flows from trust. If you are trustworthy and you demonstrate trustworthiness, by definition, you're going to be ethical. So it flows from trust. But my students will ask, well, does being ethical pay? And I'll say there's a great German word, jein, like ja and nein. It's like yes and no. It kind of depends. And there are some scholars who make the case that, and there's evidence for it, that ethics pays. But my experience as a former executive myself and other research is it doesn't always pay. You can get fired for being ethical. You could be fired for being the one that speaks truth to be powered. You can have your career derailed. Western norms are different. I'm not trying to be nationalistic or jingoist, but there are different norms. Say, go in the BRIC countries where nations, bribery is endemic. It's part of the world. So if you are a small businessman doing business in Colombia, my father-in-law worked with GE and ran their Latin operations for several years, and he would tell me those stories, that he had the power of GE behind him to be ethical, so he could do that. But if you're a startup business, you're toast because you don't have the resources. So I tell my students that yes, ethics pays, ergo trustworthiness pays, but only over the long haul, not necessarily in the short haul. And you have to be willing to take some hits where you could do the noble, ethical, courageous thing and you get fired. Or you lose the contract, you lose the big deal. But over time, I think it's the only way to fly.
I fully agree with that, by the way.
Yeah, so anyway, so how do I advise C-suite leaders? To me, you don't, I understand the spirit of your question. Are there certain stakeholders that are more important than others? At the human level, if I happen to know the CEO is a person of faith, I'll make the point that you're only just singing for an audience of one. You're singing for an audience of one, and that's the big guy or gal upstairs. That's your primary stakeholder. Now we sort of get out of the spiritual space and go into the secular real world space. I think it has to be your whole self. You can't be one person with your board and another person with the bank and another person with your clients and another person with your stakeholders. Your employees. It has to be everybody. It has to be, you are known as a trustworthy person or not.
So,
Can I
please
chime in on that? This is an idealistic philosophy that we have, but if you want to make a job better, ask the person who's doing it. The closer you get to the work surface, the better your information. So if I can convince a person in an office in Invercargill, New Zealand, who's doing this all day long, that we are a trustworthy company, I'm comfortable that I'm going to convince everybody of that. Because if you can get down through the layers, so the focus in our company, the focus is always, are the people at the desks, at the workstations, are they hearing what we're saying? Do they know we do Special Olympics? Do they know that we fired someone because of an unethical action? So I think that's simplistic, and I know it is. But it's a mental attitude that I think if you have it, you'll impact all of your stakeholders.
and sometimes the leader has to be aggressively bold with those actions so that people hear about it and
Absolutely.
it goes down through the organization.
Absolutely.
So a question to any of you. I'm still going back to this idea that suddenly trust is a hot topic. And I'm just trying to figure out, is this, so I did management consulting for a while, and after about 5 years, I realized, oh, the Harvard Business Review articles recycle every 4 years. They just change the name. They call it something else, but I think it's pretty much, I think I've seen this before. So was trust just called something different, or are we talking about trust because this is a less trustworthy world?
For a number of different reasons, I do believe that trust in people's confidence in themselves There are questions of what is the purpose of life? Purpose of work is probably at unprecedented levels. In a crazy ways, even
It's the value of work you're saying. It's because
just
people
no
are looking for purpose in their life and they're thinking about this more deeply. Trust is becoming more important.
combination of that and I would say unhappiness and search. I mean, as you know, I just came from a CEO forum the last couple of days. That's an organization of about 200 CEOs, commitments to live their lives and businesses on biblical principles. I mean, the value of the challenges with CEOs and boards dealing with, again, very, let's say, mobile and anxious workforce is at unprecedented levels because of lack of trust in everything. Church, even the army, organizations. So that's both, I think that's what's driving discussions on trust. And from a personal standpoint, that really gives an opportunity to any organization, business, churches, and so on to bring what's needed to those communities and to really differentiate themselves. So you can look at a glass being half full or being the glass half empty. I mean, there's a question from a young gentleman there. I mean, number one, look at yourself. You being the person that you want your boss or your friend or your company to be. Then also be really intentional whom you're associating with and try to look for the kinds of companies or organizations, Special Olympics, obviously it doesn't have to be for profits only, to be the change that seems that so many people are searching for. Again, a perspective.
Yeah, I think there's there can be a consistency in trust in an organization that goes back many, many years. The grounding of the company, whatever that grounding is. And I think depending upon world affairs, that goes up and down like this. Right now, it's probably at a low level because of what's going on in the world. I think it's very important to look, when you're looking at a company, to look at where their grounding is. Where do they say, this is what we believe in? We have a document that was written in 1984 by Bob Gallagher called the Gallagher Way. It's a list of 25 things we believe in. If you take that document, and now it never mentions God, but if you take that document and lay it on your desk, open your Bible to the Sermon on the Mount, and put them next to each other, you're going to see of the 25 tenets, about 15 of them match. But it never says that. But for all these years, that's been the grounding. And people read it, and some years they don't believe it. Some years they say, well, yeah, but you just had a reduction in force. So how much does that count? But other years, it's stronger. It's always a consistent, basic grounding. And I think many companies have it. And if you look on their websites, you'll see it there. The question is, do they actually implement that? Do they actually respond properly? But even if they do, certain times in history, it doesn't work. People lose trust in you. No matter what you try to do, they lose trust.
Okay, so I'm going to ask, David, for you to come at this from an academic standpoint. Is trust a hot topic in academic spaces right now?
It is. I mean, it's been around for a while, but it's
Plato and Eros. Yeah, we could back up a little bit.
This year's Davos is about trust. So, yeah, it's and in a way, it's a shame it's a hot topic because hot topics mean they become cold after a while, and it's just the flavor of the month. Reverse engineering, quality circles. You know, we can all go back through the list. But it's really about what does it mean to be a human being, and I look at it through the Abrahamic traditions and Judaism and Christianity, Islam. There's so much over, as we talked about in this paper. There's so much overlapping that there is a yearning. A good life is one that is built around trust.
So I want to switch the topic a little bit, but I want to stay with you because I think this is I'm curious as to what you'll say here. You write in your paper, your presentation about the restoration of trust, that you're going to have to, that if you've lost trust for whatever reason, you're going to spend some time in the penalty box, you're going to have to rebuild it. And there is a process of which you have to serve your time, and you have to be faithful. I'm wondering, how important the mea culpa is in that. How important is it to say, I violated your trust, we failed, whether that's because of character or competence, to say, okay, I mean, we've had some misses on some things, on delivery or whatever, and I say, okay, we're going to spend some time in the idiot box because of that. Like, there's a penalty to be paid because we just missed this number. We said we were going to do this and we didn't do it, so it's going to take a while. If I was on the board looking at this, I'd say, okay, prove it to me in the next couple quarters or whatever. But I also think it's very important to sort of own that publicly, to say, we missed, I failed, I didn't get done what I said I was going to get done. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, the mea culpa is one of the first things you have to do. And it can't be one of these weaselly things that's been written by someone other than yourself, or I regret
Mistakes
that I
were
may have harmed someone. And no, you have to say, we did the following and we realized it was wrong. And I think you make an interesting distinction, Mike, that between willful negligence, willful unethical behavior versus just a bad business call or poor execution. There's a big difference. But either way, you have to own it, or else you can't even get to step 2. You have to own it. And we mentioned time. There's just one of our, I can't remember, I think it's thesis number 10 or something. We talk about the vector of time, and here's where the faith traditions, the wisdom traditions offer something that's lost in the corporate world by and large, particularly if you're publicly traded because of quarterly earnings and so forth. If you're privately held, like Cargill or other companies, you could do things differently. But religious understanding of time it has an eternal dimension. The vector of time is very different. And the vector of time in the corporate space is, what'd you do for me today? Where are you this quarter? And I think here where people of faith, again, regardless of the tradition, they can have a certain moral courage to think differently, to think long-term. And that also includes the healing process. If your organization, or even you yourself, or I have breached trust, to understand, as much as I'd like to move on real quickly, you can't do that. Did you all remember does anyone work for Wells Fargo here? Do you remember 5-6 years ago when they had everybody knew it, by the way, that they were creating false accounts to hit their sales targets for cross-selling of products. So most banks have about 4 cross-sales, 3.5. They were going for 8. 8 is great. And it was all totally illegal, totally unethical. And I remember when the CEO was being pilloried by a Senate hearing, he said, well, it's just a few bad apples. A few bad apples. There's actually thousands of people doing this, including his lieutenant who ran that whole retail division. They all knew this. And about a month later, and a friend of mine was on the board, I won't mention his name, was on the board of Wells Fargo. And about a month later, after some apologies, they started coming out with new TV ads, with the Budweiser horses or whatever they're called, doing their thing, and the stagecoach. And I said, whoa, no, you're still in the penalty box, and you're going to be for years. They still are. So there's a desire to, if you're the causer of the harm or your organization, we all want to get out of it quickly. It's human nature. But you have to bask in that place of pain. And how do you, as the ward of the sty, how do you steward that time wisely?
So maybe you, David, or either of the other two, do you have an example of a person or a company that rebuilt trust well, that did it the right way?
I mean, the Tylenol CEO is a pretty famous example. After the casualties, it came immediately. We don't know what happened, but just up front, he had no idea what caused it. But there was just an immediate juxtaposition there with Audi when the brake sudden acceleration. I mean, there was proven at the end, really was nothing wrong with the vehicle. I guess possibly the brakes were too close to the accelerator pedal, but they lost lots of trust because in essence, they were blaming the victims. I'll just give you one more example. Again, this was not meant to be a GE story, but Arthur Welch did a beautiful job in front of Congress when he was being attacked for pushing the company for performance above and beyond expectations. There's a very famous or infamous bribery scandal where GE was bribing an Israeli general to sell products to Israel. So the company was being pillaged. Jack went there in front of the Senate, and again, the views were that we're pushing people to perform above any human expectations. And so, I'm sure it's a video clip. I mean, he says, look, for you to say that wanting if you're an athlete, to run faster, to jump higher, to be able to perform well, by expecting that, you also encourage the people to take drugs is so un-American. So inappropriate to make that correlation. By the way, we caught this. We fired the person. We told you that. We have a compliance program, and I'm sure we have 500,000 people. I'm sure this is not the only example, but I can assure you, there's no one else looking harder of making sure that everything we do is legal, it's appropriate, both the letter and the spirit of the law. So, okay, I mean, he's like, take as an exception of being senators to the United States Congress, for you to make that sort of a, quote unquote, un-American. Anyway, just a perspective on that topic as well.
There's an interesting thing going on in the insurance industry right now, where insurance companies are pulling out of states where the exposure is too high. They can't make a profit. And there's a lot, Florida, California, and there's a lot of criticism of those companies now for doing that. So the question is, should they, as an appropriate company of high integrity, remain in those states so that people can have insurance at the risk of margin? And I don't know the answer, but I'm going to ask David, what do you think of that? I'm no dummy.
You just want free consulting. Yeah, that's what you're after.
I'll send you the bill.
Thanks.
No, I start with honesty. So why are you pulling out of it? Then, or not, whether your firm or the industry as a whole, and also it's a regulated
companies, not the brokerage.
Yeah, so good point. And these are regulated industries, and most companies that are incorporated, publicly traded, they have a public service role. I mean, technically, you can have your license withdrawn. I mean, banks get nervous about that now and then. But I think there are many organizations, but it takes so much time to rebuild. And most people, there will be a CEO change, and there's maybe the zeal initially got lost, the opportunity that you don't want to, the phrase never waste a good crisis is kind of catchy, but it has to be deeper than that. You really have to internalize it and have rituals where you keep telling the story, this is where we made a mistake, this is where we did the wrong thing. But this isn't meant as an advertisement, and none of these companies are perfect. There's no perfect company, and the ones I work with aren't either. But they're trying to go, like I mentioned, Philip Morris, they're trying to go in a new direction of having reduced risk products that are 93% less toxic than the current nicotine cigarette products. So that's moving the needle in the right direction. Now, some people will always love to hate them, and they're never going to be forgiven for the past. That's also one of these theses. We have to accept that. Some injuries are too painful. But I do work with Citigroup, and they've rebounded from some of the problems where they had massive loss of trust. But it doesn't mean that everyone's going to trust them. When you're a large publicly traded company, you're just fair game today for any person with a blog, not to mention larger groups.
You said in your presentation, I wrote down two phrases, that we have to be thoughtful about being a steward of time. You also said that there are people who are master of the pigsty, and I thought, okay, there's sometimes I think that's my job.
I should have said ward of the sty, hence a sty word, Stewart. I misspoke, but anyway, yeah.
Well, so we're living in a broken world. We're broken people. You're speaking to broken people. Companies are always going to make mistakes. We've said we got to own it. For the last question here, I want to ask each of you, what do you say to people who are here thinking about faith and work, trying to integrate their faith, Sunday through Monday, through Tuesday, through, that it is part of who they are, and they're trying to have a hero of Jesus Christ, not Jack Welch. So what do you say to them? What advice do you give them, especially in light of the fact that their untrustworthiness may be a blind spot to them? I mean, that's one of my fears, is that where I am, everybody in the room knows something about me except me. and I have to create spaces for someone other than just my family, especially just my wife, because at one point she said to me, your friends are not telling you what you're doing wrong. And they're not telling you how you should be treating me better. And I don't want to be the one to tell you. Like, that's not my job to tell you that. But you don't have people that are close enough to you that are telling you the truth. And so in business, you're likely not to hear from the people whom you can fire, right? You're judging them. So I think a lot of us have blind spots that we don't see. There's a lot of fear about entering into relational conflict today. Everybody's exhausted by what's going on. So is there some real practical closing advice in a conversation about trust that you would share with yourself and sort of share openly with everyone else?
I mean, I'll go first. Again, I grew up in a communist country. Both our grandparents were wealthy. Everything was nationalized. When people used to ask me, weren't you unhappy that everything was nationalized? I was offended. Say, how can you have a world unless everyone is exactly the same except the material goods? So there was the comment of Marshall Tito being the first hero again. I was 16 when we immigrated to the United States. Fast forward, and I'll go to a couple bottom lines. I do believe that well-run businesses are among the greatest assets that any society can have. The dignity of work, providing right products and solutions. So you can say becoming a defrocked communist in the process as well. But at the end, unless you have a trust and confidence in yourself, you can never be fully capable of leading organizations. And to answer your question directly, my recommendation is to tell people what you stand for, even more than what you're against, to live up to that, and to be looking for all sort of feedbacks, invite people to provide feedback anonymously. Again, my colleague from Motorola hopefully remember, day one I came, I said, those are the top 6 things which you can expect from me, and the top 6 things I expect from you. If you have any sort of an issue, write me an email, text me. We used to do quarterly surveys. You do a 365 anonymously, so you get a feedback. You leave it with your direct report. You leave the room for 4 hours. So when I come back, tell me on the things which I'm doing well, how do I continue them? Things, trust included, where I may not be hitting the mark. What can I do to do things differently? But anyway, I can go long for that one, but that really is to tell people, again, what you're for, what they can expect. I read the 25 statements from your chairman when you spoke at Faith at Work. But do think we overcomplicate things. But always look at yourself first. Look in the mirror. Are you the role model, whether you're a 20-year-old entering into the business world or about to be a 70-year-old? Are you being truthful to yourself and to people you speak with? If the answer is good, then just keep going. If not, what are you going to do about it?
I agree with Mike. I always agree with Mike. He's a whole lot smarter and taller than I am, so there's that. I think the first thing you need to do is to set your grounding. I think you need to tell people what it is you believe in, and you need to write it down. You can't just talk about it. It's got to be on your website. It's got to be where anybody can look at it. And then you need to tell people, if you see something going on in the firm that violates one of those statements, you need to tell us. Now, if you're afraid to tell us, they can call me, which they do. They can go on, we have an 800 number, they can go on and report it anonymously. There's a bunch of different ways they can do it. But you need to report it so that we know that there's a problem. And then, this comment has been made a few times, total transparency, full disclosure. We need to tell people when we fix something. Now, we don't need to say who did it, but we need to say, this is something that is happening, here's how we're dealing with it. If it is a senior executive who's involved in it, then you probably talk about who it is. That person talks about it. They admit their mistake. So your CFO makes a decision that turned out to be negative for some group of people, and it was a mistake, he or she has to come out verbally and say, we screwed up, we're going to fix it, we apologize, but we're going to work to not have this happen again. And if you do that, those things, you do it once, people pay attention. You do it several times, they believe, and they have a trust. That grounding, again, the grounding is so critical, and we're talking about faith at work. You can, I said this before, take the Sermon on the Mount and rewrite it for your values in your company. And you don't have to say God, you don't have to say Jesus, but people will get the message. And I think that's critical.
Maybe a very practical example, and I know we're running out of time, but we've bought many companies, in companies that I've worked for, and probably the most, if you will, stressful moments in the beginning was the call to ethics, places like Hungary, Belgium, France. This comment is, if you see anything you're not comfortable with, we expect you to report it. There's annual certification, and obviously what's going on in Israel right now, but people say, wait a second, we used to do that in World War II, schooling our neighbors to the Germans. This is inappropriate. You should not be expecting this in Europe. This is, no, I obviously fully understand, but this is the view of it. Somebody stealing from a company, cheating your customers, somebody's having an abusive relationship with an employee, you're laying the whole company down. You're putting everyone else at risk. So again, a small example, if you take trust and ethics and high expectations to that level, people may not agree with you. Some people that refuse to sign their documents are going to miss you. Good luck working elsewhere. But we take ethics, trust, and the high expectations, how you behave as an employee, and as a manager to that high of a level. I apologize. If you have such strong feelings, again, we'll miss you. I respect you. But you will no longer be our colleague. It's, again, one very specific example of something of this nature.
The last word.
So blind spots, I think, was part of your question. So while fully agreeing with what you both said, let me kind of throw a minority opinion in on it, and that's asymmetric power. The reality is, no matter how much the big cheese, she or he, says, come to me, I want to hear these things, let me know, or through anonymous vehicles, helplines, and so forth, the reality is there's distrust. And a lot of employees do not want to go forward, even if it's so heartfelt, like obviously you two great leaders. So asymmetric power, how do you solve for that? Like the whole BP Gulf oil spill, people knew what the problem was. They were afraid to go forward, but BP had speak up programs and all sorts of things. Like, why didn't they do it? Asymmetric power, they were afraid. So I think one thing to maybe specifically to your point, but maybe two comments to make. One is a practical tip for leaders, and it could be any level, doesn't have to be the C-suite, any kind of leader, even a first-line supervisor. And the second is maybe a spiritual tip. The practical one, in fact, Bob, I think you and I have talked about this once. A friend we share in common, Greg Page, the former CEO of Cargill, an extraordinary guy, the highest professional and personal rectitude, and brilliant guy. He had what he called mirrors, using the phrase you used, Mike. He has 12 mirrors in his life. I don't know if that is intentional because of the 12 disciples, but he had 12 mirrors. One was a childhood buddy. One was a guy he went through training with for all of his years at Cargill. So he was a career Cargill guy. One guy from like different people, some inside Cargill and some outside. And he gave them full permission to come up and say, "You screwed up." And they had a covenant, not a contract. They had a covenant. There was that level of trust that they could do that. And I asked him, "Well, did anyone ever do it?" And he said, "Yeah, you bet." And thank God, because my wife would normally do it. For those of you who knew his wife, she certainly would have done it. Sadly, she passed, but she didn't know all the things he was exposed to, and she didn't, wasn't by his side all the time. So extraordinary leader. So find your 12 mirrors. Oh, maybe it's 6. I don't care. Find mirrors, people that you know. I mean, I get paid money to tell executives the truth because they're surrounded by sycophants. Have you ever noticed, as a senior pastor, have you ever noticed how funny your jokes are now?
Always the funniest in the room.
right?
Wow.
Right? Because you're the boss, right?
And I have a friend who talks about senior pastor humor. And he says, you think you're so much funnier than you are. My job is to tell you how bad your humor is.
So find your mirrors. Be mindful that even if you're so heartfelt that a lot of people are going to be scared. So you need those mirrors to help you. The second is a spiritual thought. When I was going through theological studies after my corporate patch, I had to, as a Presbyterian, had to take biblical Hebrew and biblical Greek to respectively read the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, and the Christian New Testament. And when in my Hebrew lessons, I came across a word which was sort of an epiphany for me. Some of you may know it if you're Jewish or familiar with it. The word is avodah, or abodah. It's pronounced slightly different ways. And avodah means three things in the Jewish Old Testament there, the Jewish scriptures. Sometimes it means work, like working in a field, laboring. That's avodah. Sometimes it means worship, as in worshiping God or Baal, worshiping Yahweh. You might remember that one verse, as for me and my house, said the Old Testament prophet, we will avodah the Lord. And the last meaning is service. So work, worship, and service. And I seldom get epiphanies in my life, but that's how I think about this whole conference, that how can my work, no matter how mundane or how highfalutin, how can my work be a way of honoring God and serving neighbor? And that's the name of the game. How can I honor God and serve neighbor through my work? So I urge you all to find your avodah and have that as a metric or a prayer or something you tap into from time to time.
Well, that is a profound thought upon which to end. Can we give a hand to the panelists?